Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Announcements by the President, bills brought from the House of Representatives, petitions, papers, reports from committees.
Senator Small.
Madam President, I have the honor to present the following report as listed on the order paper in my name. The 8th report of the Joint Select Committee on State Enterprises, 3rd session, 2017-2018, 11th Parliament, on an inquiry to examine the operations of National Quarries Company Limited and to determine its effectiveness in fulfilling its mandate by maintaining quality of product and stability of supply of state. Thank you.
Urgent questions.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Minister of National Security, given that the Commissioner of Police is now in receipt of the report on the conduct of police in the quadruple murders in Le Bray, can the Minister indicate what are the findings and what action, if any, will follow?
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the Commissioner of Police has informed me that, contrary to newspaper report, he has not received the report on the conduct of police officers in the library situation. He has indicated, however, that as soon as he receives that report, he will treat the recommendations and findings as appropriate. Madam President.
Senator Ma.
Madam President, it has been some time now this tragedy occurred in that community of Le Bray. Can the Honourable Minister indicate to us what could be some of the factors that would be detaining the submission of such a critical report to the Police Commissioner?
Senator Mark, that question does not arise. You have one more question. Supplementary.
May I ask, Madam President, when can the Minister anticipate, or when can we, the public, expect the submission of the report on this very outstanding matter?
Minister.
From the Commissioner of Police.
Madam President, as soon as the Commissioner of Police receives the report.
Next question, Senator Mark.
To the Minister of Finance. The Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, having stated that its citizens are being adversely affected by this country's foreign exchange situation, was the Minister made aware of this situation and what is being done to address it?
Minister of Finance. Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the Minister of Finance has not received any formal notification of this issue. However, Senator Mark is aware the issue of the distribution of foreign exchange is handled by the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, and the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, and as well as the members of the participants in the financial industry determine the allocation.
Senator Ma.
Madam President, can the Minister indicate this ongoing matter could have some negative consequences for relations between the both countries? Can the Minister indicate what steps the Minister of Finance intends to take to seek to rectify this matter, Madam President?
Senator Mark, that question does not arise. One more question.
Madam President, can the Minister indicate to this House whether any efforts are being made by the central bank to at least get to the heart of this challenge that seemed to be affecting negatively relations between the both countries?
Minister.
Madam President, as I previously indicated, the Ministry of Finance and, in addition, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has not received any formal communication on this matter. As and when it does, it will act appropriately.
Questions on notice. Questions for oral answer.
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, the government intends to answer question number 135, 136, 144, 145, and 146. And in respect of the questions for written responses, the government has filed responses to question number 78 and question number 173. Thank you.
Senator Mark. 135.
Well, before, I'll ask you something at the end. Okay. Question number 135 to the Minister of Sport and Youth Affairs.
Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam President. On behalf of the Minister of Sport and Youth Affairs, with respect to part 1 of the question, by virtue of the fact that the former employee was the former personal secretary to the minister, it is expected that the minister would have had knowledge that the former employee had filed a trade dispute citing wrongful termination against the Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs. With reference to part 2 of the question, the ministry does not have a complaint on file made by the former employee for which the minister may have sought and obtained information on the details of the complaint. The documents from the respective trade union representation for the former employee cited wrongful termination and, of course, would have been available on file.
Madam President, is the Minister indicating that there is no mechanism within, can the Minister indicate rather whether there are any mechanism within the Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs that would address matters of complaints by any employee, and in this instance, this employee?
Attorney General.
Well, of course, there is always a mechanism. It is by virtue of making a complaint. So once complaints are made, they are addressed. The question is very specific, whether the minister sought and obtained the details of the complaint. There was no complaint. There was a trade dispute which ensued, and of course, in relation to that dispute, details would have become known. But the fact that one cannot compel an employee to make a complaint.
Okay.
Senator Mark.
I'm cool.
Next question, Senator Mark, 136.
Yeah. Question number 136 to the Attorney General.
Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank the Honourable Senator for the question. With respect to part 1 of the question, the matter dealt with the termination of an employee by the Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs for non-performance. This then led to a trade dispute between the representative union acting for the worker, the Chief Personnel Officer, and the Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs. It should be noted that the advice of the Attorney General was not sought prior to the matter being settled. and there is no non-disclosure agreement per se. However, the parties, that is to say the employee and the ministry, executed what is referred to as a settlement agreement for release and discharge, which was settled by their respective legal representatives.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, since the Minister, the Attorney General has said there's nothing, or there's no non-disclosure agreement involved in this matter, would the government be willing to make available to this Parliament the settlement involving the parties involved?
Attorney General.
Madam President, the larger investigation and inquiry into this matter is, as is now public knowledge, the subject of a specific investigation launched by the Honourable Prime Minister. The Office of the Prime Minister established a team of persons to look into this matter. It is expected that the report into this matter will be delivered and the position will be made public soon enough. The Prime Minister's office has already spoken to this fact. So I think it's safe to say that we ought to await the outcome of that process before any undertaking is given specifically.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, in the interest of public transparency and accountability, and in the absence of any non-disclosure agreement, would not the Attorney General agree with me that it is in the public interest that that particular agreement be tabled even whilst the committee is conducting its investigation? Would you not agree with me, Mr. Attorney
General?
Sure. Madam President, I wish to be very clear on this matter. It is not every day, nor a usual circumstance, that the Office of the Prime Minister will conduct an investigation. This is the case. The Prime Minister made that announcement. The names of the persons conducting the inquiry, those were made public, and an inquiry went into effect. It is essential when one is observing the rules of natural justice that we go through a particular process. That is, if a report is made, that it is so made. If there are adverse inferences or consequences, those must be put to persons who must answer them, and therefore that process is something which must be adhered to. I want to remind you of a similar process, Madam President, when the last Prime Minister conducted an inquiry into life sport. She published that inquiry and aspects of it prematurely, as a result of which the then Minister of Sport, Anil Roberts, was exculpated because he was not put to answer questions of adverse inferences drawn against him. It is therefore imperative that one complies with process to make sure that things are dealt with clearly. I expect that this process will come to an end sometime soon, and then the Office of the Prime Minister can treat with it in the fashion that the Prime Minister suggests.
Senator Ramdeen.
Madam President, through you to the Honourable Attorney General, has the Office of the Attorney General made any inquiries of the Ministry of Sport as to why the advice of the Attorney General was not sought prior to this matter being settled?
Attorney General.
Yes, Madam President, and the simple fact is that it was not sought. It is something which will come out in due course, but I can state with certainty that my advice was not sought in relation to this matter. It's not uncommon that not every matter may come to the attention of the Attorney General. In fact, I have gone so far in the Office of the Attorney General to issue a circular in writing that matters that are to be treated with by way of consent or otherwise must have express approval of the office holder, that is the Attorney General. So it is not uncommon for every matter to not come to the, let me put it in the positive, it is not uncommon for matters to not come to the Attorney General.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, can I ask the Attorney General, given the length of time it has taken for the Wilson Committee to submit its report on this very important inquiry, can the Attorney General indicate whether the committee has sought and received additional time for submitting its final report? Can you provide the Senate with any clarification on this matter?
Attorney General.
I couldn't assist, unfortunately. I don't have those particulars. I expect that it is something to be concluded in the not too distant future. I expect it quite imminently.
Madam President, I don't know if the Attorney General is aware, but let me let him know that, ask the question. Is the Attorney General aware that the committee sought and obtained approval from the Office of the Prime Minister for a 2-week extension, which was about a month ago, and those 2 weeks have since passed, and we have not seen publicly any further requests? Are you aware, Attorney General, of any further requests by this committee for any extension of their work?
Senator Mark, that question, I won't allow it.
Well,
Next question, Senator Mark.
Is that 144?
Yes.
Yeah. Question 144 to the Minister of Community Development, Culture and the Arts.
Minister of Community Development, Culture and the Arts.
Thank you, Madam President. With respect to question number 144, it should be noted that while the Ministry of Community Development, Culture and the Arts stands ready to lend assistance to organizations in need, it is also cognizant of and respects the fact that groups, in many instances, successfully surmount challenges without its direct intervention. If this or any other group requests our assistance in any matter, we will be happy to oblige.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate to the Senate whether the matter involving Old Tech Steel Orchestra and the San Fernando West Government School has been settled?
Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. The matter has not come to the attention of the ministry, and therefore we would assume that some settlement was arranged between the steel pan and the school.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, can the Honourable Minister explain to us how, or normally, when matters like these arise, what is the process involved in these matters being drawn to the attention of the Ministry of Community Development, Culture and the Arts?
Senator Mark, that question doesn't arise. Next question. Next supplementary.
Madam President, I would like to ask the Minister, in light of the importance of the steel band movement to Trinidad and Tobago's development and growth, whether the ministry, without receiving any proper notification for intervention, and having regard to the fact that it was public knowledge of this incident, whether the minister is prepared to intervene to find out whether a resolution has been reached on this matter.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. In all instances where the ministry's intervention is required, groups either call the ministry, they speak through the community development officers that reside in the communities, or they may write the ministry for its direct intervention. In some circumstances, example this one, when there's an amicable solution to the problem, it does not arise at the ministry as a matter for attention. And so the ministry is not in the general habit of intervening if its presence is not required. However, if the circumstance is in the news daily and it's something that's fomenting, for example, the birdsong situation, in that case, we were asked and we had knowledge previous to what was happening. And so we intervened and we assisted as much as we could. So if it is something that is coming up in the public domain, we would intervene. If it is something that arises, we would take note and we would see how it develops and whether or not it requires our direct intervention.
President, is the minister indicating that, just for clarification, Madam President, is the minister advising the Senate that as far as you're aware, the matter has been amicably settled? Is that what you're saying? So that we can say that matter has been closed, involving the steel band and the school itself?
Minister.
Madam President, I'm advising the Senate that the matter has not come to the attention of the ministry, and whatever resolution would have taken place there is not a matter of knowledge within the Ministry of Community Development, Culture and the Arts.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Madam President. Madam President, question number 145 to the Minister of Education.
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, thank you very much. Madam President, you may recall that some aspects of this matter were addressed at the last sitting on a matter of the adjournment. In that context, I wish to state that the matter of the restructuring of the University of Trinidad and Tobago has been a matter of public knowledge since November 2017, when the board's decision on the restructuring of the institution's operations was articulated to several stakeholders. Madam President, at that time it was indicated that the university's top structure would be reduced from 7 vice president positions to 3. It was also indicated that the management structure of the university would be reduced by approximately 40%, with total expenditure reductions of approximately 25% within the academic body and 50% within the corporate body. Madam President, on May 11, 2018, retrenchment notices were issued for 59 academic staff. Further, UTT continues to be engaged in consultations with the recognized majority union, the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, on the university's proposal to retrench 287 non-academic staff under a Phase 1 reorganization. This will begin the process of bringing the university's staffing ratios in line with internationally accepted norms for tertiary education institutions. I thank you.
Senator Mark.
Could the Minister indicate, or could he provide the Senate with some outline or at least some understanding, Madam President, of what would be some of the elements contained in Phase 2 of the reorganization? Because you did mention in Phase 1, this is what is taking place. Can you share with us what is anticipated in Phase 2, or do you have an understanding of what is involved in Phase 2 of the reorganization of UTT?
Minister.
Madam President, insofar as I can assist, as I had previously told this House, the work going on in UTT deals with 2 particular issues. One is to ensure that UTT returns to the appropriate moorings, and 2, to ensure that what it does is in line with what we require as a country. So Phase 1 deals with the separation of a certain number of staff which is going through a particular process as established by the law. And Phase 2 would deal with any further reductions and realignment in the context of a 9-point plan, which I've already shared with this House. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, can the Minister indicate whether there's any time frame for the severing of the 287 non-academic staff?
Madam President, the time frame for the severance of any employee in UTT will be in accordance with the law and the appropriate collective agreement. Thank you.
Madam President, can I ask the Honourable Minister whether the data and crucial information that was requested by the Oilfields Workers Trade Union to determine its strategy on the way forward with the restructuring of UTT, which was requested weeks ago, could the Minister indicate whether he can provide this Parliament with any update as to the provisioning of that said information to the Oilfields Workers Trade Union?
Minister.
Madam President, unfortunately, I'm not able to provide that, a yes or no. But I'm sure if the answer is no, we will find out in the appropriate time. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Can the Minister be so kind to, seeing that he's not the de facto Minister of Education, would he be so kind enough to give the Senate an undertaking that he will circulate in writing before the end of today's sitting, or at any rate, Madam President, before the next sitting, the information that he does not have at the moment on the matter that he has referred to? Can he give us that undertaking, Madam President?
Well, Senator Mark, I'm not too sure when you say the matter that he has referred to. Is it all round, or is it specifically?
No, specifically to the matter I've raised.
Minister.
Madam President, since I'm neither de jure or de facto, I'm unable to give that undertaking.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam. Question number 146 to the Minister of Planning and Development.
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to respond to question number 146. Madam President, in relation to the first part of the question, the Economic Development Advisory Board met once on the 5th December 2017, that is during the period December 2017 to March 2018. In relation to the second part of the question, the mandate of the Economic Development Board covered a wide scope with its key elements being to develop and maintain a model of the economy that would allow for analysis of the short and long-term impacts of alternative policies and investments, to develop an approach for national innovation, to provide government with advice on the feasibility and impact of proposed government initiatives across all policy areas, economic, society, the environment, and science and technology, to the extent that these have a bearing on the country's development, to outline how Trinidad and Tobago can forge strategic partnerships with first world companies, to support Trinidad and Tobago in becoming the intellectual engine of the Caribbean and a global benchmark, to map a high-level roadmap and strategy for the diversification of the economy, to create linkages with the Vision 2030 approach and operational plans, and outline strategies to monetize the oil and gas commodity. Madam President, the government of Trinidad and Tobago is satisfied with the work of the EDAB in achieving its stated mandate. The EDAB's work program for the calendar years 2016 to 2018 has focused on the following broad areas: diversification strategy and plan, support for the development and implementation of the Vision 2030 strategy and plan, policy review and development, and transformation and institutional reform. The Economic Development Advisory Board carried out its function through the execution of several studies and projects, some of which led to the publication of advisory papers, which are submitted directly to the Office of the Prime Minister. A summary of the progress of these activities implemented are as follows. Closed-loop cycle production project. The first phase of this project was geared specifically towards research undertaken in partnership with the OAS that led to the publication in December 2016 of a draft report on the current consumption situation of styrofoam food and beverage containers in Trinidad and Tobago. This report was central to the decision by the Ministry of Planning and Development to consider the use of styrofoam products in Trinidad and Tobago within the food and beverage sector. Secondly, the Green Economy Scoping Study. This Green Economy Scoping Study will provide an initial assessment of appropriate policy options and commercial opportunities geared towards supporting a green economy transition in Trinidad and Tobago. The following policy briefs have been completed to draft. They are energy conservation and energy efficiency, renewable energy, solid waste management. Additionally, a supplemental policy appraisal document was developed to support the waste management policy brief entitled Holistic Approach to Solid Waste Management in Trinidad and Tobago. Third, an economic impact assessment of Trinidad and Tobago Carnival. Fourth, support for implementation of the National Innovation Policy. 5, technical foresighting. A consultancy on technical foresighting was completed on August 31st, 2017 through a collaborative project between the Government of Trinidad and Tobago and the Institute for Manufacturing Education and Consultancy Services at the University of Cambridge. The consultancy is aimed at supporting Trinidad and Tobago's economic diversification strategy and enhancing the competitiveness of its non-hydrocarbon sectors. 6, agribusiness. In the area of agribusiness, the EDAB collaborated with the Cocoa Development Company of Trinidad and Tobago to develop a strategic plan for the cocoa industry, which was completed and submitted to the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries in June 2017. The EDAB supported the launch of the Improved Marketing Production of Artisanal Cocoa from Trinidad and Tobago Impact Project in 2016, aimed to facilitate improved access of local cocoa producers and cooperatives to high-value international markets.
Minister, your time is up.
Thank you very much, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, given all the excellent work that this Economic Advisory Board, Economic Development Advisory Board has done, and all the excellent papers produced, can the Honorable Minister indicate to this House why did Dr. Terence Farrell tender his resignation?
Senator
this
Mark,
very important body?
I won't allow that question, Senator Mark. Next question, yes.
May I ask another question, Madam President? Can the Minister indicate whether the Economic Development Advisory Board is now FONTAS? It's dead. We'd like to know if it's dead.
Minister.
Madam President, it is public knowledge that the Economic Development Advisory Board is no longer functional, and the Honorable Prime Minister has written to all the members of the board thanking them for their service. Thank you.
Well, now it has died and been cremated formally. Can you advise this House whether all these excellent advisory papers that were done under the stewardship of this hard-working patriot, Dr. Terence Farrell and his team, could you tell us whether those documents would now be made public and tabled in the National Parliament?
Madam President, the product of the work of the EDAB, which I've outlined, has become very evident in the country. And I'll use the example of the Vision 2030 document, which was laid in this place and is the subject of a joint select committee. And I will also say that the styrofoam, for example, the government has taken certain position. There's a draft bill, and several aspects of what I've outlined is finding its way into government policy and in some cases into Parliament for further consideration. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, I am very happy to hear what my colleague has said. Could he also share with us, Madam President, whether the other advisory papers, which seem to be very profound in richness and depth, can the Minister provide his Parliament with an undertaking that those documents can be laid for public consumption on the table of the Parliament?
Minister.
Madam President, I give no such undertaking.
Would the Minister... Oh, yeah, I can now stand to raise another matter. Yes. Can I ask you, Madam President, to invoke Standing Order 2715
yes,
in relation to question number 132, because I think, if my memory serves me right, the Minister had sought a 2 weeks delay or deferment at the last sitting 2 weeks ago, and 2 weeks has passed, and there's no answer to this question.
Standing Order 2715 will be invoked in respect of question number 132.
Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on definite matters of urgent public importance, public business, government business motions.
Minister of State in the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I beg to move the following motion standing in my name. Whereas it is provided by Section 53(1)(a), D, E, F, and G of the Children's Community Residences, Foster Care and Nurseries Act, Chapter 4604, hereinafter referred to as the Act, that the authority may, with the approval of the Minister, make regulations for inter alia. A, the management of any community residence, the imposition of requirements as to the accommodation and equipment to be provided in residences, foster homes and nurseries, the medical arrangements to be made for protecting the health of the children in community residences and foster homes, the provision of information to the authority by the managers as to the facilities provided for the parents or guardians of children in community residences and foster homes to visit and communicate with the children, and where not provided, to authorize the authority to give directions as to the provision of such facilities, and all such matters and things for effectively carrying into operation the provisions of the Act. And whereas it is provided by Section 53(2) of the Act that regulations made under this section shall be subject to affirmative resolution of the Parliament. And whereas the Children's Community Residences Rehabilitation Centers Regulation 2008 were made by the authority under Section 53 of the Act on the 20th day of February 2018 and approved by the Minister on the 50th of March 2018. And whereas it is expedient to approve the said regulations, be it resolved that the Children's Community Residences Rehabilitation Centers Regulations 2018 be approved. Madam President, from the onset, I want to state that this government has clearly demonstrated a commitment to ensuring the care and the well-being of all children in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, the motion before this Honourable House is a further indication of that commitment that we place to the children of Trinidad and Tobago, particularly those that are vulnerable, those that are in our care facilities, and those that are in our rehabilitation centres. The Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2016 was another demonstration of our commitment to ensuring the rights of our children in Trinidad and Tobago and guaranteeing those rights. Madam President, the Family and Children's Division Act of 2016. This act not only established a new Family and Children High Court division, but also amended 18 statutes that articulated with the then bill. It has introduced the Children's Court to adjudicate over a wide range of children's matters, peer resolution, and children drug treatment court processes as two of the modern concepts for diversion and rehabilitation of child offenders being administered by these courts. Honourable members will recall that a package of children's legislation was enacted to establish a new child protection system, and the Children's Authority was established to administer this new child protection system. Community residences comprise both children's homes and rehabilitation centers. Children's homes are for children in need of care and protection, requiring institutional care, as well as children under the age of 10 in conflict with the law. Rehabilitation centers are for the placement of charged or convicted child offenders aged 10 and over. At the time of the implementation of the new system in May 2015, the Children's Authority had responsibility for licensing and monitoring both children's homes and rehabilitation centers. The Children's Act of 2012, which was changed the definition of a child offender to 18 by reference to the definition of a child who was defined as a person under the age of 18. Madam President, the Children's Act of 2012 came into force in May 2015, setting up a new child offender regime that, as I mentioned, extends the age of a child offender to under 18. This child offender jurisdiction was now coexisting with the regime established under the Young Offenders Detention Act, otherwise known as YODA. YODA made provision for offenders between the ages of 16 to 18 and were capable of rehabilitation to be placed at an industrial institution. In 1949, the Youth Training Center, otherwise known as YTC, was proclaimed as an industrial institution for males. The conflict between the Children's Act of 2012 and the YODA, therefore, had to be resolved, and this was done via the Family and Children Division Act of 2016. The YODA was amended by that act to bring all rehabilitation centers under the management of the Commissioner of Prisons, and there was good reason for this. The existing rehabilitation centers were partially administered by the Anglican and Catholic churches, which did not have the capability to manage significant numbers of charged or convicted child offenders up to the age of 18. And Madam President, over the months and years, we would have had numerous examples of things emerging in the media where young children who are in conflict with the law at those facilities would have endured some form of either abuse, or the homes could not manage because of their personality and what they were going through, and they did not have the proper regulations in place to govern the way the homes operate, and also to guide children going into those facilities on what is expected of them. So today what we're trying to do is to address all those anomalies within the rehabilitation facilities and within our community residences. A system of designation was introduced by the amended order. Rehabilitation centers were no longer to be licensed by the authority, but had to be designated a rehabilitation center by the Minister of National Security after consultations with the Commissioner of Police and the Children's Authority, and upon designation would be deemed a rehabilitation center after extensive infrastructural and operational measures. YTC was designated a rehabilitation center. To ensure that rehabilitation centers, now under the management of the Commissioner of Prisons, conform to a modern child offender detention system, reforms were introduced via the amended order, and very comprehensive and modern child rehabilitation centers regulations were made by the Minister of National Security in 2017 for the management of rehabilitation centers. One important change introduced by the amended order was the Children's Authority would no longer have a licensing function with respect to rehabilitation centers. However, the amended order provides for the consultations with
Senator, the Minister is making her presentation on the motion. Yes, she seems to be reading, but she's also speaking about the motion as well. Because the Minister is leading off, I will allow her some leeway in this matter. I understand that there will be overlap with the motions, and that is why I'm allowing the Minister that kind of leeway. Minister, continue.
Madam President, these two sets of regulations are inextricably linked. So in order to present on the rehabilitation centers and even in community residences, there would be overlap, and I would have to speak to the issues because there are commonalities. Madam President, what we're trying to do with the regulations is to ensure that we have the right care plans in place at the rehabilitation centers, ensuring that when a child is placed at that facility, they will enter into the facility with full understanding of what is required for them to be rehabilitated. That would mean that the rehabilitation center would have to, under the supervision of the Children's Authority, develop a care plan that would guide the child throughout the period at the facility, ensuring that the child's psychosocial needs, developmental needs are taken into consideration. Madam Speaker, one of the key features of the regulation also is the fact that on entering the institution, the child must be given access to a handbook, a policy manual, a policy document that outlines what is required in terms of the child's behavior, how treatment, how punishment will be meted out to the child, Madam President. Also, how the home, the rehabilitation center, would operate. One of the key things that we recognize in treating with issues pertaining to children is that oftentimes when our children end up in the institutions, in the past they would have been forgotten and their developmental needs would have been left to chance. What we are doing by these regulations is ensuring that every child, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what would have landed them into that facility, would have the opportunity to emerge a better person and to be reintegrated into society. But to do that, we had to ensure that we have the right systems in place. We have the right people to work alongside the children, that those who are charged with the care and protection and rehabilitation of our young people have the right skills, the right attitude, and the right aptitude. ensuring that the facilities they are placed in don't contribute to their harm and further demise, but also contribute to their development and their enhancement by ensuring that the physical plan is a plan that reflects what a child needs to grow and to grow efficiently, to grow effectively, and to grow to become a citizen who contributes to the development of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, this motion we are debating today is not one that I believe that should be politicized, but one that we should look at and embrace, because we are not working on it for political gains or for no, we are working on it to ensure that those who will be charged with leading Trinidad and Tobago tomorrow have the opportunity to enjoy their childhood, have the opportunity to have their rights respected, have the opportunity to develop and advance and grow, so that when the time comes that they take over the reins of leadership, that they are well-rounded and disciplined boys and girls. Madam President, we have seen in the past where hurt children turn up to become hurt and damaged adults who go on to inflict harm on society. What these regulations are trying to do is to ensure that we put the facilities in place, the systems in place to ensure that our children who enter into those rehabilitative facilities emerge better than they would have entered in, Madam President. Madam President, I'm wearing blue today. My child abuse.
May I just ask a question, Minister? A very brief question. Is the government willing to consider proposals for amendments to these regulations?
Thank you, Senator. If the proposals are indeed suitable and they would enhance whatever systems we have in place now and further strengthen what we are proposing, there's no reason why we wouldn't consider it.
Thank you very much.
Right. As I said before, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to ensure that we put a rigorous system in place to protect the child. The principle that we are working with is the best interest of the child. So whatever suggestion, whatever recommendations, what's the best interest of the child is at the core of it, we will embrace it. So as I was saying, Madam President, I'm wearing my Child Abuse Prevention Month and my Child Awareness blue today because I wanted to draw attention to the fact that as we work in this honorable chamber, that our focus should really be on looking at strengthening systems to protect those who will then come and care for us tomorrow. Strengthening system to ensure that any child who has, for some reason, come into conflict with the law, that child is not forgotten, but that child is nurtured and given the opportunity to then grow and advance and contribute to the development of Trinidad and Tobago. These regulations are a step in a holistic plan we have to transform the childcare system of our nation. Madam President, in some aspects, we are leading in the Caribbean, but there's still work to be done, and I welcome the opportunity for debate today to see how we could further advance this course. I thank you.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose the question for debate. The question is, whereas it is provided by Section 53(1)(a), (d), (e), (f), and (g) of the Children's Community Residences, Foster Care and Nurseries Act, Chapter 4604, hereinafter referred to as the Act, that the authority may, with the approval of the Minister, make regulations for, inter alia, a, the management of any community residence, d, the imposition of requirements as to the accommodation and equipment to be provided in residences, foster homes, and nurseries, e, the medical arrangements to be made for protecting the health of the children in the community residences and foster homes, f, the provision of information to the authority by the managers as to the facilities provided for the parents or guardians of children in community residences and foster homes to visit and communicate with the children, and where not provided, to authorize the authority to give directions as to the provision of such facilities, and g, all such matters and things for effectively carrying into operation the provision of the Act. And whereas it is provided by Section 53(2) of the Act that regulations made under this section shall be subject to affirmative resolution of Parliament, and whereas the Children's Community Residences Rehabilitation Centres Regulations 2018 were made by the authority under Section 53 of the Act on the 20th day of February 2018 and approved by the Minister on the 5th of March 2018. And whereas it is expedient to approve the said regulations, be it resolved that the Children's Community Residences Rehabilitation Centers Regulations 2018 be approved. Senator Ramdeen.
Thank you, Madam President. It is indeed a pleasure to be able to begin for the opposition the debate on this particular motion. I want to begin, Madam President, by setting out at the very outset the way in which I propose to treat with the motion and how I propose to structure my debate and my contribution this morning. Firstly, I want to address the issue of the way in which the child in our jurisdiction is seen in the eyes of the law. I want to then move on to the international developments that have shaped our duties as a state towards children, to then address from a domestic perspective legally what are the existing provisions that characterize and shape the rights of a child with respect to the three crucial pieces of legislation that form the fundamental platform upon which these regulations are promulgated. The manner, I then want to move on to the manner in which the regulations are to be implemented, and finally to deal with whether these regulations as proposed by the government will achieve the aims that are required under the three pieces of legislation that were promulgated in May of 2015. That is the Children's Act 2012, the Children's Community Residences, Foster Care and Nurseries Act 2000, and the Children's Authority Act. Madam President. Madam President, I just wanted to know if my friend will give way for...
Sure, of course.
It's just a procedural matter, Madam President. I'm not sure if in moving the motion, the Minister has made it clear that when we say that the government will take into consideration any suggestions for amendments which may arise in the debate, it is for future consideration. I think on a previous regulation, the Attorney General outlined the position as it relates to regulations which come from the House and our ability to make changes to those regulations. And we are in a similar position in this case, because to take amendments in this House would require us to restart the process, having regard to the fact that the motion that's before us speaks to a particular set of regulations. So what the government wishes to say is that in the course of debate, the suggestions which are made by my colleagues would be taken into consideration for further amendments to the regulations. Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I want to begin by trying to set out what we are tasked with here as a Parliament today, and what should be the objective of each and every one of us, and the government, principally, because it is the government that is promulgating these regulations. And it is an issue that has come alive in many jurisdictions, and I want to borrow the words of the House of Lords, and more particularly Lord Hope, in an appeal that is very popular to those who have studied this area of law. It is the appeal to the House of Lords in the Venables and Thompson matter. And it is said that every system of criminal justice has to face up to the problem of how to deal with children who commit crimes. It is worth repeating here the words with which Harper J. began his judgment in R. Whitty, and which Lord Laurie quoted in C and the DPP, and I want to commend those words to the government. No civilized society, says Professor Colin Howard in his book entitled Criminal Law, regards children as accountable for their actions to the same extent as adults. The wisdom of protecting young children against the full rigor of the criminal law is beyond argument. The difficulty lies in determining when and under what circumstances the protections should be removed. Madam President, the child in our law is a very unique feature because not very long ago, the full rigor of the criminal law was met out to children in the 18th and 19th centuries, where you had children who could have been hung once they were convicted of a criminal offense in the case of murder. And up to the very late 20th century, you had circumstances in which the children in most Commonwealth jurisdictions suffered the same punishment that was met out to adults, and there was no distinction. In our jurisdiction, we do not have a constitution that defines specifically the rights of the child, as is the case in South Africa. And what we rely upon to flesh out what the rights of the child are principally the preamble of the Constitution that reaffirms that people of Trinidad and Tobago have affirmed that the nation of Trinidad and Tobago is founded upon principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God, faith in fundamental human rights and freedoms, and importantly, Madam President, the position of the family in a society of free men and free institutions, the dignity of the human person, and the equal and inalienable rights with which all members of the human family are endowed by their Creator. That, coupled with Section 4A and Section 4B of the Constitution and Section 52A of the Constitution, really provides the foundation or the ground norm, as it is known in the jurisprudence, of what the rights of the child are and how those rights have developed. Because, Madam President, the passage of these three pieces of legislation in 2015 was really an acknowledgement by the Parliament at that time of the manner in which the rights of the child had developed, and domestically, those three pieces of legislation represented what I would term the worldview by all civilized democratic countries as to how a child was no longer to be treated in the way in which a child was considered previously. And we had the concept of a child citizen, where a child would be recognized in the eyes of the law as a person, a human person, an individual endowed with certain unique rights. And these three pieces of legislation that were enacted on the 15th of May 2015 sought to give statutory underpinning to that concept of the child citizen. And in our law, up to 2015, there was very little in the jurisprudence in our country that defined what those rights really ought to be. And it cannot be beyond dispute now that a child in our society has evolved from one of property in the plantocracy to one that is seen as a ward of a parent in the early 20th century, to now in the 21st century as persons in themselves, as deserving of liberties and freedoms in their own right. And therefore, those pieces of legislation, Madam President, really lay the foundation for recognizing in our domestic legislation, and I will take you to that, Madam President, of the international norms that developed over time with respect to our children. And while I hear the Honourable Minister, and no one can doubt that the Minister, in piloting this motion for the Parliament to approve these regulations, is, with all good intent, seeking to protect our children and to provide places of protection and safety where we can advance as a society in ensuring that our children who find themselves in problems with the law have a place in which they can receive rehabilitative treatment, and we can provide them with the opportunities and the mechanisms that they are needed in order to be rehabilitated and to be restored back as members of our society. And while the words of the minister, the Honourable Minister, were that the government has demonstrated that they are for the rights of children, and therefore this is yet another step, one can't help but recognize, Madam President, the way in which our children are under attack at present. The number of young persons under the age of 18 that only recently, last Friday,
in a triple murder in Laventille, you had the unfortunate circumstances of a 16-year-old child being shot in crossfire, that we must understand that the passage of regulations alone and the provision of community residences and children's homes, while it is a large step forward, it is not enough to protect our children today. Because as we speak today, Madam President, the position is that the duties and responsibilities that are placed upon the authorities, whether it be the police service, the Children's Authority, who under the law, the Children's Authority Act, as well as the Children Residences and Foster Homes Act, has the duty under these pieces of legislation to monitor these institutions for which these regulations are provided, are failing miserably in discharging their duties. Because on a daily basis, I don't know if the Honourable Minister is aware, but the passage of these pieces of legislation has a history, these regulations has a history behind it. And the history behind it is that the government, by court order, was mandated to do this. It was not voluntarily done. It was done by court order. And that is part of the context in which this must be considered. And in saying so, Madam President, one has to wonder whether the Children's Authority, which under the legislation is supposed to be the police, for want of a better word in inverted commas, for whether these regulations that we are asked to approve will be carried out, will be implemented, and whether they would be the managers of these community residences and rehabilitation centers will be discharging their functions pursuant to this. Whether the Children's Authority are even provided with the resources to be able to implement this. Because passage of the legislation alone is not going to protect the rights of these children. The reason why I made that point, Madam President, it is because under section, if I can be allowed to take you, Madam President, to the legislation itself, under the Children's Act, that is the Children's Act that was passed, the reason why it is important for these regulations to be promulgated, approved, and for community residences to be established in accordance with these acts, it started because of a challenge that arose because of the failure of the authorities under Section 54 of the Children's Act. And under Section 54 of the Children's Act, Madam President, it says, a court on remanding or committing for trial a child who was not released on bail shall order that child to be placed in the custody of a community residence named in the order for the period for which he is remanded or until he is brought before the court. And while I accept that when these pieces of legislation were passed, there was no community residence licensed under the Act to comply with the provisions of the three pieces of legislation in May of 2015, we are, in June of 2018, promulgating regulations for a law that was passed in May of 2015. That is, we are past 3 years for these regulations to have come into effect. And during that period of time, there was absolute non-compliance with the mandate of the law because there was simply no regulations put in place. And the minister quite commendably said, this is not a political matter. Let us try and treat with it in the best interest of the child. And I will get to that best interest principle shortly. But it cannot be satisfactory, Madam President, for an administration that claims to have children at the forefront of their priorities to have taken 3 years to bring regulations that the law mandated since May of 2015. So the regulations are here, and we have found ourselves as a parliament with them before us, and so let us treat with them. Madam President, there are two aspects that define, there are two principal pillars that define the rights of a child, which have been fleshed out in the legislation. And if we want to conceptually understand the process as to how we got here, first of all, there are international obligations that Trinidad is a party to. Those international obligations have found themselves in domestic legislation, which I will point out. And that domestic legislation has now found itself in being fleshed out in the regulations that we are asked to approve. That is the framework within which we find ourselves here. But, Madam President, it's important for us to understand that there are certain, when we treat with the rights of the child, there are certain fundamental bases that we must understand. The first is that if rehabilitation and restorative justice is at the heart of these regulations, we must turn our mindset away from the old regime, which is when a child has found himself in difficulty with the law, the system that operated was one that was targeted as finding out what did you do. It has always been a system, an inquisitorial system of finding out what did you do. And the modern thinking of juvenile justice is one that has transformed itself into asking another question, which is targeted at finding out what went wrong with that child, instead of trying to find out what did that child do. And these regulations should be targeted at that question as to whether, if these regulations are implemented, would we as a society be in a position to implement the principle of the best interest of the child? And that is the fundamental core of what we are being asked to do. The best interest of the child is a principle that has been internationally recognized by all of the international conventions that Trinidad is a party to that deals with the rights of the child. And if I can be allowed, Madam President, and before I get into it, Madam President, let me just say for the record and the Hansard, before we started the debate this morning, I provided all of the senators with all of the research material on behalf of the opposition that helps the senators understand what we are here to do, what are all the, I provided all of the international documents that Trinidad is a party to, and all of the research material that forms the basis of this to each and every senator to assist them on behalf of the opposition. Madam President, let me now take you to the second part of what I said would be part of my contribution, which is the way in which the international community has treated with the rights of the child. And let me start, that journey, Madam President, starts in 1924 with the Geneva Declaration on the Rights of the Child, which was the first international document that recognized and gave effect to the rights of the child. And let me put on record for the Hansard that in 1925, the Geneva Declaration stated in no more simple and unobjectionable terms the following. 1, the child must be given the means requisite for its normal development, both materially and spiritually. And we should perhaps put a marker there on spiritually, because I have yet to see in these regulations that have been proposed that there is any provision for the spiritual practice of the children's religion in these. Let's deal with the rehabilitation center. Number 2, the child that is hungry must be fed, the child that is sick must be nursed, the child that is backward must be helped, the delinquent child must be reclaimed, and the orphan must be sheltered and secured. 3, the child must be first to receive relief in times of distress. 4, the child must be in a position to earn a livelihood and must be protected against every form of exploitation. And 5, the child must be brought up in the consciousness that its talents must be devoted to the service of fellow men. I know that I don't want to go into too much details of these, Madam President, because my fellow senators are going to drill deeper into all of these matters. After the 1924 Geneva Declaration on the Rights of the Child, the General Assembly of the United Nations had a Declaration on the Rights of the Child in 1959. And there were certain principles that were fleshed out in that declaration. The first of those principles, Madam President, is that the child shall enjoy all the rights set forth in the declaration. And those declarations, I'm not going to go into all of them because I have provided them to the Parliament. But the most significant, for our purposes, international convention that Trinidad has been a party to is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC, United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, sometimes described as the Magna Carta of Children's Rights. And on the 30th of September 1990, remember that date, Madam President, on the 30th of September 1990, Trinidad and Tobago signed the convention, and on the 5th of December 1991, it was ratified by Trinidad and Tobago. It developed a world consciousness on the rights of children to see them as rights bearers and not simply as collateral or to be subsumed in the rights of their parents. And it established 4 main principles or pillars of children's rights. By Article 2, non-discrimination. By Article 3, the best interests of the child. By Article 6, the right to life, survival, and development of the child. And by Article 12, the view of the child, the new view of the child. Those rights that were fleshed out and for which Trinidad and Tobago, as an international, as a state party, ratified and signed on to in 1990 and 1991, were never, at any point in time until 2015, made part of our domestic law at all. We remained in a position where we were signatory to an international convention on the rights of the child that was ratified by Trinidad and Tobago, and not a single step till 2015, Madam President. That is 25 years we remained dormant in activating the rights that were given by that convention. While the international community was striding leaps and bounds towards recognizing the rights of the child, we took absolutely no step for 25 years until 2015. And the important and significant step that we took in 2015 was by virtue of the enactment of the Children Community Residences, Foster Homes, and Nurseries Act. And let me read into the Hansard, Madam President, that one of the purposes of this piece of legislation was to enact into our domestic law the provisions of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And let me just correct myself there, Madam President. It was Section 3A of the Children's Authority Act. Section 3A of the Children's Authority Act that did what I just indicated. And let me read Section 3A into the Hansard. And it is that by Section 3A of the Children's Authority Act, the objects of this act are to promote the well-being of all children in Trinidad and Tobago. B, to provide care and protection for vulnerable children. And most importantly, Madam President, C, to comply with certain obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it was a significant step by the government of that time to implement and pass this piece of legislation because it recognized, and I want to emphasize that word recognize, because those rights that were incorporated in these 3 pieces of legislation, the Children's Authority Act, the Community Residences, and the Children's Act, simply recognize what had already been fleshed out in the international community. And, Madam President, let me then take that with respect to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, that the United Nations didn't stop with the passage of that particular convention. That was then followed by the Beijing Rules of 1990, which continued the orientation of the global view on the rights of the child and the treatment of children with specific reference to juvenile justice. That was the Beijing Rules. I have also annexed those for the benefit of all senators. That was followed by the Havana Declaration on the Rules, the Riyadh Rules, and the Tokyo Rules, all of which I have provided and which I will go into in some detail to show up whether these regulations comply with what we are required to do as a state and what the children are entitled to as part of the criminal justice system. We have had, in our jurisdiction, Madam President, our jurisprudence has come alive in relation to the way in which we treat children. And for the purposes of the debate, let me make reference to the fact that from the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in the appeal of Sipasar and Pancho, which I think that appeal really shows the manner in which children were treated because those two persons were two children who committed murder 30 years before they were actually released. And they remained being treated as adults for 30 years in our prison system before their sentences were reviewed and they were eventually released. And I think that emphasizes the manner in which we sought to treat our children before the court started to recognize. And let me just borrow the words of Lord Hope in that appeal, where he said, "Protection and welfare lie at the heart of these provisions. Regard must be had throughout to the welfare of the child or young offender." And that was in 2012. But in 2004, Madam President, we had a significant jurisprudential leap forward in the Privy Council and more particularly the speech of Baroness Hale in what we commonly refer to as the Dr. Naidiki appeal, where in a concurring judgment that treated only specifically with the rights of the child in that particular matter, Baroness Hale, relying on a very important decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in Roper and Simmons, highlighted the important differences between juveniles and adults and placed specific emphasis on the fact that there were important differences in the criminal justice system that required us to treat with juveniles differently from adults, and that is what we are being asked to do here today. There is a lack of maturity in juveniles, their vulnerability and susceptibility to negative pressure and outside pressure. The transitory personality traits of juveniles must be taken into consideration. Importantly for this discussion is the observation that the important aim of sentencing is to promote a process, and this is important, Madam President, because this is what we are supposed to be doing here today, is to promote a process of maturation, the development of a sense of responsibility, and the growth of a healthy adult personality and identity. And then Baroness Hale went on to say, it is important to the welfare of any young person that has need to develop into fully functional, law-abiding, and responsible members of society is properly met. But that is also important for the community as a whole, for the community will pay the price either of indefinite detention or of further offending if it is not done. And therefore, what we should be doing, Madam President, in trying to put in place regulations that are supposed to look after the welfare and the restorative justice that is supposed to be meted out to juveniles and children who find themselves in trouble with the law, is to not simply put together a system of rules that is supposed to govern what really and truly is a prison, but to flesh out, by virtue of these regulations, what the international community has already recognized to be the requirements. And this is no mystery. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Beijing rules, the Havana rules, the Riyadh rules, and the Tokyo rules sets it out in black and white as to what we should be doing and the manner in which these rehabilitation centers are supposed to provide for the best interests of the child. And while one cannot criticize the government for bringing forward the regulations, one can certainly criticize the fact that these regulations, as they stand, in the form that they stand, and I think the question from Senator Choate, which is the government prepared to accept recommendations to improve on what is put before us today? And the answer from the acting leader of government business is simply they will do it in the future. It's just not good enough. Because it is not good enough because you cannot come here and say you want to act and your administration is acting in the best interest of children. They want to put the best interest of the child first. But when you have in front of you in black and white what those recommendations should be, what we are presented with is a far cry from what is represented as the international norm. And I say so without apology. Madam President, the truth about this matter is this. When the government was faced with the fact that they must find rehabilitation centers for children who under Section 54 must be placed mandatorily in rehabilitation centers, the government didn't go on a journey to put together a rehabilitation center, you know. What the truth is, they took YTC, which was never meant to be a rehabilitation center, section off parts of it, make some improvements, paint it up, put some rooms and dormitories and beds there, and declare it by the Minister of National Security as being a rehabilitation center.
Crying shame.
The mere fact that we are provided with regulations where a rehabilitation center is going to be run by the Commissioner of Prisons, under a superintendent of prisons, to be administered by prison officers, to anyone who is not qualified in child care or psychology or child psychology, it will tell anyone with common sense that that simply does not satisfy the yardstick that the legislation has set out in the Children's Authority Act, in the Foster Homes and Care Act, and in the Children's Act. And anyone with an inkling of intelligence, taking the different pieces of international law, the international conventions, the benefit of the rules that the UN has given to us to use as a guide in implementing this regime, will understand the shortfalls in these regulations. And the fact that the government is not prepared to accept recommendations now to change what is put before us, and not only to change, Madam President, but more importantly, to improve on what is placed before us in the best interest of the children who are the heart and the core of what we are asked to do here, really tells you and demonstrates to you and proves to you whether the intention of the government is really one that is centered upon the best interest of the child. And let me just say so, because I don't think I would have made the effort and the opposition would have made the effort to share with each and every member of the Senate the material that we have resourced, without having the good intention of trying to make this work. And therefore, I am speaking as the first speaker on behalf of the opposition, and I would like to ask the acting member, the acting leader of government business today, that perhaps he would reconsider and the government would reconsider that position in the best interest of all of those children who are involved and who will be affected by this, Madam President. Because we are not here to oppose these regulations. We have done the work. We have shared the work. We are here to help the government to provide, because we understand, Madam President. Madam President, the biggest problem that we face today as a society is that we are losing the battle of saving our children from the crime and the gangs that are involved and are the bane of our society today. The prison system has failed them. The Children's Authority has failed them. The YTC has failed them. Every single public institution that is supposed to be set up aimed at carrying out their duty to protect the children have failed. And that is why we find ourselves in this position today. And let me just show you the extent. Let me demonstrate to you, Madam President, by one regulation, one. Madam President, allow me to take you to Regulation 16 under Part 5 of the regulations that we are asked to approve today. And let me just demonstrate to you, Madam President, in the little time that I have left, because I don't have the time, my fellow senators will assist me in that, in drilling down in them. The most important principle that comes out of all the treaties, all the laws, all the regulations, is that without doubt, the best interest of the child is supposed to be paramount. It is supposed to be paramount. That comes out of the UN Convention, and I will take the last few minutes that I have to demonstrate that. But, Madam President, look at Regulation 16 and go to Regulation 16.5. And 16.5 says, the best interest of each resident shall be considered at all times in the application of the Act. Right? That's what it says. You must consider it. Madam President, let me tell you, if I can be allowed so to do, Madam President. Madam President, listen to what the Court of Appeal had to say about this. Listen to what the Court of Appeal had to say about this. In the context, sorry, Madam President, I apologize. Let me quote for you. I'm quoting for you from Civil Appeal number S244 of 2015. A judgment
Senator
delivered
Ramdeen,
by Justice of Appeal.
Senator Ramdeen,
Sorry.
you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me just deal with this quickly. A judgment delivered on the 28th of April, 2016 by Justice of Appeal Peter Jamada. And this is what Justice Jamada had to say. In the context of minors, and because of the duty on judges to prioritize the welfare of children, which both by local legislation and international obligation is a paramount consideration, judges have a clear inquisitorial role to play. And let me just read out this quickly, Madam President, and understand the shortfall in what we have been asked to do here. This is what Justice Jamada said. In fact, in constitutional proceedings affecting minors, the best interest of the child must be a primary consideration. Primary. Further, the best interest principle operates as a substantive right and as an interpretative device. What is clear from all of these pieces of judicial dicta, Madam President, is the fact that the best interest of the child is not a principle that you just slap into a piece of legislation and expect that it will work like that. The actual provisions of the legislation must demonstrate that the best interest of the child is not to be considered as is set out in the legislation. It must be paramount. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child says every administrative body that treats with the rights of the child must treat with the rights of the child as paramount before every other consideration. How can we be asked today to approve legislation that says on the face of it, you take it into consideration, as if it's just passing? Madam President, there is much to be said about the content of this piece, of these regulations. And I will have another opportunity when we deal with the community residences to treat with that. Again, and to highlight the deficiencies. But what I want to ask the Honourable Minister and her staff to do is to simply read the international documents that the United Nations has set out and compare that to what we are being asked to do. Madam President, before I close, I want to take the opportunity in this debate to do one final thing. When one examines the development of the Children's Authority and one examines the development of the Children's Act and the Children Foster Homes and Children Residences Act, I want to thank the administration that brought those pieces of legislation into power after 25 years of declaring that we were a party to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It took 25 years. From my experience, I'm privileged to be able to say I want to put on the Hansard. I want to thank Ms. Sharifa Ali Abdullah, the first director of the Children's Authority that was appointed, that got that authority off the ground and put it in a position that it could have protected the rights of the children. I want to thank Ms. Christelle Gemon, the Deputy Director of Care, Legal and Regulatory at the Children's Authority, who has done a fantastic job to get that authority off the ground. And I want to pay tribute, not only to thank, but to pay tribute to Justice of Appeal Peter Jamada and Justice Vashish Kokaram.
Senator Ramdeen, I don't think, have a seat please. I don't think it is appropriate to be bringing members of the judiciary into the debate, and I would ask you to desist from that, please.
I am guided, Madam President. Well, I want to thank the United Nations for all of the work that has framed the jurisprudence in this area and the law that has allowed us as a society and as a country to be able to benefit and to be able to put things in place. And I hope that the government will be guided and will take the advice and the help and the assistance that we will offer in the best interest of each and every child that finds themselves in trouble with the law and may be subject to these regulations. I thank you, Madam President.
Senator Mahabir.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, first, hospitality. Let me commend the Honorable Minister for piloting what I think may be her first piece of legislation in our chamber. And I think this is valuable legislation. I think, Madam President, few will dispute the fact that we are making some progress because no regulations existed before, and now we are seeing regulations before us with respect to the welfare of children in the community residences in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, regulations are supposed to be clear, they are supposed to be precise, they are supposed to be understandable, and they are supposed to give a guide to those who are given the responsibility of discharging their functions under the law. In this regard, Madam President, I will focus on the regulations themselves. And it is my hope that if the Honorable Minister holds the view that any of the recommendations made will result in an improvement in the welfare of children under the care of the community residences, that she will, notwithstanding the policy decision of the government, take them seriously as long as they will enhance the welfare and well-being of children under the care of the state. Madam President, I will focus on a few clauses. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 14, 16, 17, 19, 25, and 27. So I will focus on a fair amount. And the reason I mention this, Madam President, is this. I know our standing orders are very clear with respect to the uses of the Statutory Instruments Committee, with respect to negative resolutions only. But I recommend that what was before us should have been given sight to that committee. So it may warrant some change to the standing order. Because if sight was given prior to me or members of the Statutory Instruments Committee, many of the issues which I'm raising on the floor today, I'm sure would have been sorted out. So that's something to consider at the Standing Orders Committee and even the Business Committee of the House. Because we are debating regulations now for the first time. Well, it's not normal we are debating the bills, but the regulations are peculiar in their own, and I think we need to look at measures for economy and efficiency in time use. Madam President, let me delve immediately into the concerns I have, and they are meant, the recommendations I am seeing are meant purely to achieve two functions. One, clarity, and second, the welfare of the child. If we take a look at regulation number 4, it says the superintendent at the rehabilitation center shall be provided with relevant and continuous training, that's the superintendent and staff, with respect to the care and management of residents. But that is vague. That is an intention. What does relevant and continuous training mean? Does it mean once every quarter? Does it mean once every year? Does it mean once every 5 years? What about at the end of Regulation 4, that the superintendent and staff at the rehabilitation center shall be provided with relevant and continuous training with respect to the care and management of residents, and there shall at least be one training session during the year. If we were to add some qualifier, we know that the administrators are duty-bound to have at least one session in the year. And if they don't, then they can be held accountable. Because 4, as it is, holds no one accountable, because there is nothing to judge them against, given that continuous and relevant are very vague. Madam President, let me focus on Clause 5. I say clause, I know I mean Regulation 5, but let me focus on Regulation 5. Regulation 5, and this is where I speak about the use of language. a rehabilitation center shall be adequately lit, adequately ventilated, suitably furnished. Why could we not say a rehabilitation center shall be adequately lit and furnished and ventilated, or adequately lit, ventilated, and furnished? If we do that, we immediately compress a number of the adequate. We know we need to be adequate, but I recommend that the rehabilitation center in Regulation 5 be adequately lit, ventilated, and furnished, and immediately we compress A, B, and C into one sentence. Let us look, so that's with respect to the economy of words. Let us look at Regulation 5.2, and Regulation 5.2, again, same amount of repetition that I am seeing, because I'm making these comments, Madam President, because regulations are supposed to be precise. They are supposed to be clear, and the reader should not get lost in all the excess words which are in the regulations. It says a rehabilitation center shall have a potable water supply with tank storage, and again, sufficient storage facilities. So we have storage in A, storage in B, and my own position is, why don't we say in regulation, for example, 5.2, a rehabilitation center shall have sufficient potable water storage facilities to meet the needs of residents. So, Madam President, if we were to do that, we are going to immediately, again, remove a number of excesses, subclauses, and it will make the regulations very, very clear. The concern I have, before I proceed, Madam President, is that this appears to me to be a first draft. And I don't think there was a second stage of scrutiny where someone went through the regulations to make sure that it was tighter and that there was a greater level of clarity so that the intention of the regulation would be without challenge. Let us look at Regulation 6, for example. It states, the perimeter of a rehabilitation center shall be secure, but secure in what way? Regularly inspected and maintained, and a log shall be kept of inspections and maintenance. The perimeter of a rehabilitation center shall be secure. One certainly would hope so, that the perimeter is going to have a measure of security. But is it, Madam President, secure with the use of cameras? Is it going to be secure with the use of barbed wire? Is it going to be secure with the use of a concrete fence? I think while the law can be general, I think the regulations should be more precise. Couldn't we say that the perimeter of a rehabilitation center shall be securely fenced? That would be more precise, because we know now there should be a fence as opposed to simply having guard dogs on the premises or any kind of observation cameras. Once we say that it should be securely fenced, then we know the individuals who designed these centers will be able to examine the fence of the structure and determine that if the fence is a wooden fence, they would recommend it be replaced by a metal fence, a wire fence, a railing or something, so that, but it should be securely fenced. Because if it is just secure, Madam President, it leaves too much room for us to have vagueness, and whenever there is vagueness in a regulation, many things will not get done. And I'd like to get the fence to be secure. Let us look at Regulation 7. I am not going like my colleague, Senator Ramdeen, on the welfare of the international welfare of the child. I'm going at the regulations themselves, in detail, which is something I think we need to be looking at carefully. So let us look at what Regulation 7 says. And I'm really grateful, Senator Ramdeen, for the various international agreements on the child and so on. And I'm sure all of us subscribe to these. But it is putting into effect now those objectives, laudable as they are, that is important. 7 2 says, where bunk beds are provided, such beds shall be outfitted with safety railings and ladders where necessary. I am confused. Here is a bunk bed. I have seen bunk beds, and we are talking about children. These are not bunk beds for adults. In order to get up to bunk number 2, which is the higher bunk, you do need a climbing mechanism, call it a ladder. Why is it that we put in where necessary there? I thought it is mandatory that you have a ladder with railings to climb up safely onto the top bunk. And when you reach the top bunk, there will be at the side of the bunk bed a railing so that if during the night the child is turning, it will be a restraining device. So my point is, 7.2 should read, each resident shall be provided with, and it's where bunk beds are provided, such beds shall be outfitted with safety railings and ladders, full stop. I don't see why where necessary comes in. Because you see, who is to determine where necessary? The child is at a height. The child can fall. I think it should be mandatory. So that if it's one thing I'd want the Honorable Minister to consider is some of these small amendments. Madam President, regulation number 8. Regulation number 8 says, a rehabilitation center shall have adequate toilets and bathing facilities. Well, one would certainly hope so, that they would have adequate toilets and bathing facilities. You don't want a rehabilitation center to have inadequate, and I would imagine the managers of such center would have the requisite international ratios. I am not sure what these ratios might be, such that if there are 4 children, there should be 1 toilet. For each 1 to 5, there should be a toilet. But what concerned me with Regulation 8 is that we are speaking about adequacy of toilets and bathing facilities without saying that we should also have separate toilet and bathing facilities for boys and girls, males and females. I would recommend that the beginning of 8 reads, a rehabilitation center shall have adequate toilet and bathing facilities with separate toilet facilities for both males and females. Yes.
Senator, will you? Okay,
sure, I'll give you.
In terms of the toilets for male and female in a rehabilitation facility, boys are housed one way and girls, so there's no mixing.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Honorable Minister. As long as there is no mixing there, then that particular concern of separate toilets, so that I'm hoping that adequate, I did not understand also what adequate meant, and I don't know, maybe in your winding up, you can indicate to us what the ratio is so that we would be able to test the ratio when we examine the facilities. Is it 1 toilet for each 5? Is it for each 10? I don't know. I'm sure there are international norms so that once there is an examination of these facilities, we should know based upon the residents whether the toilet facilities, the bathing facilities are in keeping with international norms. Yes, I give way again.
Madam President, just for elucidation, to support, well, to strengthen the point of the Senator, we have no list of the rehabilitation centers, so you can't be blamed for not having...
Senator Obika, please just take a seat. Senator Mahabir, just take a seat.
Yes.
That was a little unorthodox.
Yes.
You normally would give way if the minister who is leading the motion, wanted to intervene to highlight or elucidate some point. Okay? So, continue, Senator Mahabir.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We are in unorthodox terrain with respect to regulations, and we will have to establish, Madam President, those procedures. But really, we do need to get, in order to test the regulations, you see, it's okay, Madam President, to place some things in a regulation, but we need to evaluate them. And we need to evaluate them via numbers. And Senator Ramdeen's position is quite right. Internationally, there are norms, and we would like our centers as well to comply with these international norms. We just were not told what these norms are. Let us look, Madam President, at Regulation number 9. Regulation 9 says, a rehabilitation center shall have adequate facilities for the needs of a resident with a physical disability. What does it mean? This is so imprecise and so vague. Who is to determine what is adequate? Is it that there is some independent body in Trinidad and Tobago which would look at the facilities and determine that they deal with the differently abled, and they would say, these facilities are adequate or inadequate? Is it that a ramp up to the building is adequate, and that you do need to house these students, these residents in the ground floor? Why don't we just say in Regulation 9 that a rehabilitation center shall be designed to cater to the needs of the differently abled? You see, if the rehabilitation center is already designed by law to cater to the needs of the differently abled, then the issue of adequacy does not arise, because the design of the center, as determined by the architects designing the center or those who plan the buildings, would already have factored in restricted mobility and other restrictions on someone as part of the design of the building. So I don't know what adequate is. And when we have adequate facilities for the needs of a resident, there is always too much subjectivity. And when there is subjectivity, I think it will result in injury to those we want to protect, which really are the children. Madam President, let me look at Regulation number 10. Regulation number 10 deals with the handling of food and meals preparation. The kitchen, in Regulation number 10, the kitchen of a rehabilitation center shall be provided with sufficient and suitable kitchen equipment. Well, I'd imagine that a kitchen will have kitchen equipment. Why don't we just say in 10 that the kitchen of a rehabilitation center shall be provided with suitable and sufficient meals preparation equipment and be of appropriate size? Because once you talk about kitchen equipment, you talk about a range of things. What really constitutes kitchen equipment? What you really want is meals preparation equipment. It would include pots, it would include pans, it would have the necessary washing facilities, and it would have things like trays to make the sandwiches and decanters and so on for the drinks and the juices, so that you need proper meals preparation equipment, and you also want the kitchen to be of appropriate size, so that the wording here does not capture what we want this kitchen to do. What about 10.1c, 10.1.3? It says, the kitchen of a rehabilitation center shall be provided with adequate facilities for the preparation and storage of food. Well, why do we need to have the words preparation here? Because in 1, we already are saying that we have suitable and sufficient meals preparation equipment. So there is duplication in 3. All we need to do in Regulation 10.1a.3 is to speak about adequate facilities now for the storage of food. We have already covered earlier adequate facilities for the preparation of food. And you see, Madam President, my concern is this. When we bury these things separately, we know that maybe they will not get done. Let us focus on meals preparation equipment. Let the administrator know that the legislators wanted appropriate and adequate meals preparation equipment. And let us now focus on 10.1A3.111 on the storage of food, because storage is going to be very important for health and welfare. We do not want bins which are open so that there could be an infestation of rodents. We do not want weevils attacking the grain and the rice. So we do need facilities for the storage of food which are really going to come up to certain international best practices. So I recommend that 10.1A3 be amended. So you remove the excessive words for the preparation of, and you simply put adequate storage, adequate facilities for the storage of food. When we look at 10.2 and 10.3, 10.2 says, food served to a resident shall be properly and safely prepared and handled. So we expect that. 10.3 said, staff preparing and serving food shall have valid food badges and shall ensure that food is properly and safely prepared and handled. Madam President, maybe it's my old experience in supervising so many theses that we go through the theses and we remove excess. We want to get to substance. Because, Madam President, if we look at 10.2, it says food served shall be properly and safely prepared and handled. That is an intent. That is an intent. But food 3 says that staff preparing and serving food shall have valid food badges and shall ensure that food is properly and safely prepared and handled. So that if we already have staff ensuring that the food is properly and safely prepared and handled, and they have valid food badges, then 10.2 is excessive and duplicative, because 10.3 will automatically cater to 10.2. And so I would recommend we simply remove 10.2 altogether, which is adequately covered by subclause 10.3. Madam President, let us look at clause number 14. I myself was very surprised that I had so much interest in these regulations, Madam President. I thought that I'd have interest only in the exchange rate and so on, but these regulations are of interest to me because I, like everyone else in this chamber, would like the best law to govern the welfare of children in Trinidad and Tobago. And my one position is, let us, in the Senate, do what we can do to provide to the administrators of these centers the best guidance, given our collective knowledge, on what should be done to ensure that the welfare of the child is protected. And the regulations, therefore, should be clear. Let me focus to regulation number 14. Regulation number 14, and I'm looking at 14.2, there shall be recorded in the register of residents with respect to each resident, and this is where we are keeping a record, his name, his age, his sex, his address, the offense for which he has been charged. So we are creating a profile of each resident. But, Madam President, what surprised me is that when I examined 14.2A to I saw nothing about recording any pre-existing medical condition. I know in the regulation for the next go, they are talking about pre-existing medical conditions, but in this one before us, the residences, I am not seeing any regulation with respect to any pre-existing medical condition. You would think that the administrator of this facility would want to know, in addition to everything from A to I, that the resident, newly admitted, is experiencing or has suffered from asthma in the past, and therefore may think it wise to have a stock of asthma medication in his or her facility. You would think that the administrator would want to know that the patient has had some condition, heart condition, that was detected earlier and will be cognizant of it. So that I would recommend we have in Regulation 14.2, we add a J and we add any pre-existing medical condition, which I consider to be vital information, so that, let me read exactly what it says. There shall be recorded in the register of residence with respect to each resident, and I am recommending 14J, any pre-existing medical condition. And then I want to recommend to the Honorable Minister 14K, his immunization record and name/contact information of his last treatment facility. I think it is important for the administrator to also have maybe a scanned copy of the immunization record of this resident in the database, and also the name of the last facility where he or she was treated. It could be a health center, it could be at the Mount Hope, it could be a private doctor, so that in the event of any emergency, there is on file at the center those requisite information. Pre-existing information, Madam President, a pre-existing medical condition, and an immunization record, and the name of his last medical doctor or treatment facility where you could refer to and get the, Madam President, the history of the child. 14.4, Madam President, let me examine clause 14.4. It says, the residence handbook shall be in such a simple form. What does a simple form mean? Why don't we say that the residence handbook shall be written in such simple language? That is precise, that is clear. So the residence handbook shall be written in such simple language as would reasonably enable a resident to understand its content. Saying a simple form, again, lends to more imprecision than I think should be accepted. 14.8. In 14.8, we are looking at 14.8b, that upon the entry of a resident into a rehabilitation center, we said medical and mental screening of the resident shall be conducted. I agree with that, but I wish to add that it should be done within 1 week. You said, you see, it says, upon the entry into a rehabilitation center. Let us be precise with respect to upon the entry. Is it on the same day? It can't be on the same day, because the resident may be admitted at 11 p.m. But let us say within a week there shall be this medical evaluation. Madam President, 16, clause 16. A resident of a rehabilitation center shall be provided with food that is. Why don't we replace food that is with meals which are approved by a registered dietitian and which are suitable for his dietary needs, health, religious persuasion, or cultural background? Once we include, Madam President, a registered dietitian into the mix, we know that the food that is served in the center is guaranteed to be the type of food that is consistent with his age and whatever peculiar conditions he may have. So I would recommend to the Honorable Minister that we replace food that is with meals which are approved by a registered dietitian and which are then suitable for his dietary needs. And that this would therefore mean that 16.1A3, 16, okay. Madam President, I would leave that 16. Let me move on to 19.3. 19.3 says that a resident shall not be denied access to his attorney at law. Thank you very much, Madam President. A resident shall not be denied access to his attorney at law. But I thought that nowhere in Trinidad and Tobago is someone to be denied. Maybe Senator Ramdeen will advise me if there is any way. Even on death row, I understand that an inmate there has access to his attorney at law. A resident shall not be denied. I would think that we need to stress, it says nothing, because that is a truism. We don't have to put that in regulations. Why don't we say that replace with 19.3 the following: a resident shall within reason be able to communicate with his attorney at law whenever he wishes. And that is, he can't communicate at 2 a.m. in the morning. He can't communicate when his attorney may be expected to be asleep. But within reason, he should be able, under reason, and we could determine in law what is reasonableness. So that I would recommend that would make sure that if, in fact, the resident says he tried to call his attorney at 3 p.m. in the afternoon and he was prevented from so doing, we know that someone somewhere is not complying with the regulations. Let us, Mr. Vice President, look at regulation number 25. Number 25, and it's 25.4. 25.4 says, where a resident in the care of a rehab center has died, the commissioner shall ensure that any particulars in relation to the death of the resident are recorded. I think the commissioner ought to do more than that. Not only record the death, I would recommend the following. Where a resident in the care of a rehab center has died, the commissioner shall initiate a full investigation with respect to the particulars of the death and undertake all other actions as prescribed in law. And finally, Mr. Vice President, I come to regulation number 27. Number 27, it says that the authority shall immediately be notified of the following in writing: the discharge of a resident, the threat or abuse of a resident. I would recommend that the authority shall immediately be notified orally and in writing. The discharge of a resident, the death of a resident. The reason I put orally and in writing here, Mr. Vice President, is that a resident has died. What the regulation simply says is that the administrator must write the authority, and it may take, post? It may take 2 weeks for the notification. Why don't we simply call the authority and say, a resident has died? And we send a written note to confirm our call, or a resident has gone missing. Because what it says, the escape of a resident from legal custody. I think this is something that ought to be very much, Mr. Vice President, prompt. So as soon as there is an escape that we have learned of, you should call the authority immediately and indicate that we have an escapee. We shouldn't write them. Writing might take 2 weeks, by which time that inmate may have disappeared from the jurisdiction. Mr. Vice President, I have a series of amendments that I would like to propose to the Honorable Government, to the Honorable Minister, and to the government. And in accordance with the relevant standing order, I submit the following amendment to the motion before the Senate to approve the Children's Community Residences Rehabilitation Centers Regulation 2018. That the motion be amended by adding the following words immediately at the end of the resolution, subject to the following amendments before coming into operation. Regulation 4, after subsection 2, insert the following new subsection 3. There shall be at least one training session for all staff members during each calendar year. Regulation 5, A, delete proposed subsection 1 and insert the following. 5.1, a rehabilitation center shall be A, adequately lit and ventilated, B, appropriately furnished, C, properly maintained and cleaned, D, equipped with adequate laundry facilities, and E, kept in good structural repair, both internally and externally, to ensure good and habitable living conditions. 5B, delete proposed subsection 2A and insert the following. A, sufficient portable water storage facilities to meet the needs of residents. C, delete proposed subsection 2B and renumber accordingly. D, delete proposed subsection 2C and insert the following. C, proper garbage disposal facilities. And E, delete proposed subsection 2D and insert the following. D, a maintenance schedule for all items used at the rehabilitation center. Regulation 6, replace the word secure with the words securely fenced. Regulation 7, in subsection 2, remove the words where necessary. Regulation 8, in subsection A, replace the words adequate toilet and bathing. Well, I will amend that since the minister did explain why there was no need for separate toilet facilities. Regulation 9, delete proposed section 9 and insert the following new section. A rehabilitation center shall be designed to cater to the needs of the differently abled. Regulation 10, A, delete subsection 1A1 and insert the following. 1, suitable, sufficient, and functional meals preparation equipment and be of appropriate size. B, in subsection 1A3, remove the words the preparation and. C, in subsection 2, after the words handled, insert the words by staff who are in possession of valid food badges. And D, delete proposed subsection 3. Regulation 14, A, after subsection 2.1, insert the following new subsections. J, any pre-existing medical condition of the resident, and K, his immunization record and the name of his last medical treatment facility. B, in subsection 4, replace the words shall be in such a simple form with the words shall be written in such simple language. And C, in subsection 8B, after the words conducted, insert the words within a week of entry. Regulation 16, A, in subsection 1A, replace the words food that is with the words meals which are prepared by a registered dietitian and that are, and delete subsection 1A3. Regulation 19, A, after proposed subsection 2, insert the following new subsection 3. 3, a resident shall, within reason, be able to communicate with his attorney at law whenever he wishes, and B, renumber accordingly. Regulation 25, delete proposed subsection 4 and insert the following. Where a resident in the care of a rehabilitation center has died, the commissioner shall initiate a full investigation in relation to the particulars of the death and undertake any other action or actions as prescribed in law. Regulation 27, A, delete proposed subsection 1B and insert the following. B, any escape of a resident from legal custody and any missing or missing residents. B, subsection 1D, after the words resident, insert the words as reported by staff or by the resident himself. And C, delete proposed subsection 1G and renumber accordingly. Mr. Vice President, I beg to move.
Mr. Vice President, I rise to second the amendment to the motion raised by Senator Dr. Dhanayshar Mahabir, and I reserve my right to speak later in this debate.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator.
Senator Ramkissoon is proposed amendments. Did you rise to second the proposed amendments?
So do I. So I rise to second the proposed amendments by Senator Mahabir.
Thank you. The amendment to the motion has been seconded by Senator Ramkissoon. Honorable Senators, the question is that the motion be amended as read and circulated by Senator Mahabir. Senators taking part in the debate hereafter may speak on the original motion and the proposed amendments. Honorable Attorney General.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President and incoming now Madam President, I thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's sitting of the Senate. I had not intended to be here. I was literally at my office and I was tuning in to listen to the contribution of my learned colleagues in the Senate, and I heard Senator Ramdeen offer a very passionate and strong advocacy for certain aspects of this legislation, which I feel I need to address in part. Madam President, I'm pleased to come into this debate just after Senator Mahabir has spoken, and I'd like to clarify what we're doing today in as best a fashion as I can. We are here today to treat with a motion. The motion is that we, by affirmative resolution, accept the Children Community Residences Foster Care Nurseries Act prescription, which says how we are to promulgate and make subsidiary legislation for children's community residences, rehabilitation centers, regulations. Let's jump back. Trinidad and Tobago has, in its parent law, treated with the children's package. The children's package came about into sharp focus in or around the year 2000, some 18 years ago. In the period 2000 to 2018, we have seen the birth of, and very importantly in the year 2008, we saw the birthing of the Children's Authority and the laws into packaging. In the period 2008 to 2012, we had a very significant portion of amendments come to us. Very importantly, under the last government, there was a unified purpose of opposition and government, then PNM opposition, then UNC government, and we passed the Children's Act 2012. In fact, we did that without a single independent senator supporting, not one. And that was a very unusual occasion in the Senate, that 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning on that day, which I vividly recall so well. Because then the independent senators held the view that unless we had abolished child marriage, and unless, in their view, same-sex relationships were sorted out, they were not prepared to support the legislation. That was the simple point. Then both government, UNC government, PNM opposition, undertook to look at the issues presented in the Senate. As Attorney General, I was very pleased to pilot the abolition of child marriages. We know that story. We are now in court where the issue of homosexuality or same-sex is being treated with in the judicial context. I won't say more. There are approximately 27 laws standing on the books of Trinidad and Tobago which treat with that. So the Children's Act came about in 2012. I heard my learned colleague, Senator Ramdeen, say something. Perhaps I got it wrong because I was listening whilst doing something else. But then I heard Senator Mahabir say it. Because he repeated what I believe he understood, as I did Senator Ramdeen to have said. Senator Ramdeen, as I caught it, and please, Senator, if I got it wrong, I apologize, said that it is unacceptable that the government has taken 3 years to bring regulations, and that effectively there were no regulations, and that we should be reminded that it was by virtue of a court order that these regulations are effectively now before us. If that's what I heard, because I heard Senator Mahabir certainly treat with it, let me set the record straight. In 2014, specifically, I sat as a member of this House, this Senate, in the 5th session of the 10th Republican Parliament. We were invited in the Senate on the 3rd of December 2014 to approve the Children's Community Residences Regulations 2014, so made under Section 53 of the Children Community Residences, Foster Care, Nurseries Act 2000. So there are existing regulations, and they have stood part of the laws of Trinidad and Tobago since the 21st of January 2015. So let's get that straight. If we didn't pass these regulations today, regulations exist. They have existed since January 21st, 2015. So why are we now treating with regulations in the manner that we're doing now? Because it's very wrong to say that regulations don't exist. This government was not sitting on its hands for 2.5, nearly 3 years. We have not only now come to treat with regulations because none existed before. Regulations are on the books and have existed. So what brings us here? What brings us here is the evolution in what we have done in the principal laws. We know that as a government, we came with the Family and Children Division Bill. We took, by way of that creation of law, a very different approach from the Family and Children Division Bill, which my learned colleagues, when in government, brought, and which did not see the light of day. We took the Family and Children Division Bill, but we amended, instead of amending 3 laws, in just a couple of pages of cross-reference amendments that Family and Children Division Bill under my predecessor government had, we came and we amended in Schedule 5 of the Family and Children Division Bill 19 laws of Trinidad and Tobago. And in doing that, we sought to do surgery to the treatment of rehabilitation centers versus homes. So the product before us today, the first limb of what we are adopting today by affirmative resolution, is the creation of the regulations for child rehabilitation centers, and we separate out children's homes. In the 2014 regs, which became perfect in January 2015, the regs were the Children Community Residences Regulations 2014. The two were conflated. We dealt with homes, we dealt with child rehabilitation centers in one law. What we have done as a result of the significant work that the government has undertaken in protecting the rights of children by way of amendments to primary legislation, by creation of subsidiary legislation, is we have created 3 separate subsidiary regulations and laws. One, which is done just by way of order of the minister, and that, Madam President, was done in 2017 under the hand of the Minister of National Security, Edmund Dillon, dated the 15th day of May 2017. It is referred to as the Child Rehabilitation Center Regulations 2017. That's the first limb that we did. The second limb that we took, we had to disaggregate the 2014 regs, which dealt with both child rehabilitation centers and children's homes, separate them out into 2, which is why we have 2 motions on the table now. Treat with child rehabilitation regulations on the one hand, and treat with regulations for children's homes on the other hand. And that's the business of the Senate today, as we debate motion number 1. In treating with the Children Community Residences Rehabilitation Centers, I heard my learned colleague Senator Ramdeen refer to international best practice. And I do ascribe to the same philosophy that my learned colleague does, that Trinidad and Tobago ought to adopt the most prudent and international best standard practice for itself. But can we get there today immediately, particularly when the submission is made that it is infradig to have the prisons manage child rehabilitation centers as this motion allows, when international best practice has it somewhere else? And Madam President, the simple answer to that is that we are not capable on the 12th of June 2018 of putting that best practice into effect for a number of reasons which I will treat with in a short while. In summary, however, they include plant and machinery, i.e. the physical structures, services and training, that is the input that has to go with it, and thirdly, the proper facilitation and coordination of the other articulating arms which must work with that system. And I'll come to that in detail in just a moment. But Madam President, I'm now obliged to treat with the allegation that we are here because of a court decision in treating with these regulations. Madam President, permit me to put onto the record that there's a chronology of events. The facts of the case speak such that that could never be the truth or the case. Permit me to read into the record some of the chronology that brings us here today. It was on the 26th of September 2008 that the Children's Authority Act was assented to. That's 2008. That's why I referred to it a little while ago. September 29th, 2008, we had the Community Residences Act 2000, amended by Act number 15 of 2008 and Act number 12 of 2012 when we later treated with it. And we made changes to Section 2, where the definition of children's home, and Section 54, placing of children's home and community residences happened. But the genesis for that was September 29th, 2008. We started with one unit where homes and residences were managed together, and then we separated them out. Why? Because a child rehabilitation center is intended to treat with the heavier end of the law, the remanded and more serious offenses, in everything from murder come down for children. Because like it or not, we in Trinidad and Tobago, like elsewhere, have children who are accused of committing murder. The children's home is a different environment where we treat with children in need of care, where we treat with that old concept of beyond control, where we treat even with the remanded side of what we call under 10ers. Because it may not be appropriate to put an under 10 child who's alleged to have committed a serious crime in a child rehabilitation center, so we allow the flexibility of the children's homes. That's why we separated out the two, because they're two very different systems of management. And when you cross-pollute, you may find children in need of care being mixed with children who are remanded for serious matters. They are then exposed to a level of criminality, a level of social difficulty that may take them on the wrong path. And that's why this government saw it necessary to separate out children's homes from child rehabilitation centers. On the 6th of August 2012, we had the assent of the Children's Act 2012, supported by not a single independent senator. On the 16th of January and the 19th of January 2014, there was a particular case in 2014 where 2 minors were alleged to have committed murder. On the 29th of January until about July 2015, we had the remanding of these particular children in the system which existed then. But listen to this. It was on the 7th of August 2014 that a UNC cabinet under Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessar took a decision, 1, to construct 2 rehabilitation centers to address the needs of children in conflict with the law. 2, that the Ministry of Land and Marine Resources identify suitable parcels of land to facilitate construction of rehabilitation centers. And 3, that the Ministry of Gender, Youth and Child Development collaborate with the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ministry of National Security to determine the operationalization of rehabilitation centers. On the 29th of January 2015, the Children's Authority regulations and the Community Residences regulations, as I just referred you to, came into law. So the regulations existed. On the 26th of February 2015, a UNC cabinet took a decision to construct new rehabilitation centers for boys and for girls at Aripo Road, Wallafield, to the appointment of a management board to govern the operation, and for new rehabilitation centers to operate in a particular way to include counseling, sport, etc. 14th of May 2015, Cabinet took the decision, listen to this, to proclaim sections of the various suite of children's legislation. 14th of May 2015. On the 18th of May 2015, provisions of the Children's Act number 12, 2012 were brought into force. Listen to this. 18th of June 2015, decision was taken by the Cabinet to use St. Michael's as an interim community residence. An interim community residence. The 9th of July, Cabinet took a decision to approve funds for construction at Wallafield. And in August, St. Jude's was the subject of decision of a UNC cabinet to be used as a temporary rehabilitation center. So let's put this now into translation. There is nothing that permits the creation of an interim child rehabilitation center or a temporary child rehabilitation center. But a UNC government took that decision. And they took that decision knowing that they had to build child rehabilitation centers. They instructed NIPDEC be involved. They looked at land, etc. But what happened next was astounding. The previous Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago, under a UNC government, went to court to challenge this government, which had just come into office, for a breach of constitutional rights, for a failure to have child rehabilitation centers in law and in fact. Because the submission of Attorney General, as he was, now Attorney at Law Anand Ramlogan, is that in law you could not have an interim child rehabilitation center. That you had to have, before you proclaimed or contemporaneous with the proclamation of the creature in law called a child rehabilitation center, you had to have the thing in fact. And that is the decision of the court that has caused odium. It was never a decision of the court that there was no regulations. The regulations existed. I've just put the facts on the record. It was the failure to have the actual in-law child rehabilitation center that went to court and caused the government to have to accommodate children in the circumstances then that resulted in the payment of almost $100,000 per month to house one child, with a declaration of damages to be paid for the state breaching its own proclamation. So imagine that. Let's put it in the simplest form possible. UNC, when in government, says, right, nice thing, pass child rehabilitation law, proclaim the law. Let's do an interim thing. It doesn't exist in law, but we'll do it anyway. Because nobody in their right mind would want to challenge the state while we know they are working the process out. But when the government changes, you know what? Don't worry about that. We'll go and sue ourselves for what we did improperly, and we'll go and get damages and costs for it. That is what we are treating with today. So, Madam President, let's get to the details.
Attorney General, may I just remind members of my previous admonition that I want members to remain silent. If there is to be crosstalk, it has to be done, under the my reader. Okay?
Coming from the House as I do, I'm almost immune to the banter, but I thank you for the direction. Madam President, so let me make it pellucidly clear. The only unconstitutionality and court decision that affected child rehabilitation centers was the failure of the UNC government to actually have a child rehabilitation center. And I heard a condemnation. Now, let me put this on the record. I value Senator Ramdeen's contributions. I think he comes genuinely to make the best approaches in the law. At times, we have to adopt a bit of political clothing and get a little bit sharp. So let me not take away from the submissions which will come from my learned colleagues opposite when we get to committee stage. I take them with the best intentions possible. I understand the political banter, but I must set the record straight, Madam President. When we are treating with the unconstitutionality, it was for the failure to have a center. Now, the other point raised by my learned colleague, Senator Ramdeen, was that what we did is we went and we retrofitted a few cells and we fixed up YTC, and YTC wasn't designed to do that. Madam President, it is clear that the UNC government took decisions to award contracts or step into the realm of creating child rehabilitation centers. Wallerfield, new contract, billion-dollar suite. But Madam President, they didn't do it. The only thing that they did under 4 ministers of justice was to award the contract for the judicial complexes in breach of the Central Tenders Board. And when we pointed it out, they had to scrap the process. Trinidad and Tobago in 2015 saw a new government come in with a small gift from my learned colleagues opposite, which was a reduction of our central government revenue by 96% because they forgot to close the door on the deferred taxation write-off positions. And in those circumstances, in relation to child rehabilitation centers, we take great pride in saying, first of all, I want to offer a serious note of congratulations to the Prisons Service of Trinidad and Tobago. And let me tell you why. And when I offer this note to the Prison Service, I also want to specifically point out today the Prisons Officers Association. You may have noticed recently that you don't hear criticism coming out of the prisons. In fact, there's more of an approach of unanimity in change and reform. You'll hear a commissioner of police saying it's not good enough that certain things happen. You'll hear the association saying that they're on board with reform processes. In the constraints of a 96% drop in revenue, we took great pride in taking a particular arm of the YTC division of retrofitting and doing work at that arm to bring constitutional muster. We created 36 brand new dormitories. We amended the conditions. We separated out the user environment. The YTC arm, which is now a child rehabilitation center, was done for $1 million TT dollars. $1 million. And in doing that, we had the judges go there, do site visit. We had the Children's Authority side by side in the regulatory approaches as the authority does these regulations. And I want to single out a gentleman by the name of Mr. Scantlebury today, prisons officer as he is, in the stand up and do the work approach that he and Commissioners Alexander and Commissioner Commissioner Wilson have stood up and just done the work. And let me tell you why it is not infradig and so far off of international realm for us to have the prisons manage child rehabilitation centers as these regulations do. It's because they are the best trained in the field. They take specialist officers to do the work. They apply them into this realm. And I want to tell you something, Madam President. Thanks to an initiative by this government, Corrections Canada, under the auspices of Commissioner Head, who's the head of Corrections Canada, have been in constant cooperation with us in Trinidad and Tobago and the prisons officers and the prisons itself and the Ministry of National Security and the Attorney General's office to do the reform of the prison system, and we started with children. So is it infradig for us to have the Prisons Authority involved in child rehabilitation centers, to have them de jure and de facto licensed to hand this out? No, it is not. Is it the best in class United Nations position? No, it is not. Are we in a situation where we could do like Sweden or Norway and have you seen the videos? To have the type of rehabilitation centers where they play guitar all day and have rooms and flat screen TVs and recidivism is an easy concept for them? No, we are not there yet. But what we have done in treating with our children separately is to manage the process definitively. And let me tell you where it connects to the rest of the architecture. It wasn't by mistake that we came here and asked for judge only, as we are working out with the judiciary and the other stakeholders for the proclamation of that. Because in the judge-only scenario, the lads and lasses, the lads in particular at YTC, said to us, "Sir, we have a deep concern that when we committed a crime when we were 12 years old and we stand before a jury, that a jury will just see the hardback man or hardback woman at 25 and 27 years old as opposed to the 11-year-old and 12-year-old child." And they said to us that they would happily elect for judge only because the judicial mind could factor the consciousness of the child at 11 and 12. So, Madam President, there is merit in parking the Prisons Authority, the Prison Service, in this legislation. But, Madam President, Senator Mahabir has proposed an amendment. We're flagged that there are proposed amendments. I heard Senator Choate ask the Honourable Minister if we were going to have room for amendments. Let me explain what amendments are, how they can be factored, and what can be done. Let me state for the record, I'm very pleased to say that the government will record, as we always do, all observations. We have demonstrated, as the order paper will show, that we're prepared to come back to Parliament time and time again to fix it, because there's no one perfect legislative sweep. Those perfect legislative sweeps have resembled the 18 years it took to do DNA, the 26 years to do plea bargaining, the 30 years to do abolition of preliminary inquiry, the 30 years it has taken to do motor vehicle and road traffic amendments. That's what a perfect legislative sweep looks like. Analysis, paralysis. So, Madam President, the recommendation today coming from a learned colleague, Senator Mahabir, is that we amend the motion, because that's the only way we can do this. The process to cause the amendments is as follows. If the amendments are taken on board to amend the motion, that the regulations be amended subject to X, here's what happens. It goes back to the minister, pre-House of Representatives. It is taken on board by way of amendments. It is then published. It is laid in the House of Representatives. It is put for affirmative resolution in the House. It then comes to the Senate. It is put for affirmative resolution in the Senate. We went through this dance most recently in the DNA regulations. And what was asked then is relevant today. Is there anything so draconian, so mischievous in these regulations now that make us compelled to restart the entire process ab initio? The Senator Mahabir's recommendation that we change suitable meals to meals approved by a dietitian, is that so draconian in its mischief that it must be treated now? It's a good submission. What about if I get judicially reviewed that I didn't have a dietitian certify the menu? And then I get another claim for breach of constitutional rights because it wasn't done because a dietitian didn't turn up because we didn't have the resource to treat with it. You see, in today's world of litigation, and in today's world of litigation just for so, we have to be very careful about what we prescribe in the law. Senator Mahabir made, in essence, a submission that said that there was a degree of duplication in the language in certain sections. He is absolutely correct. Why is there a duplication? Number one, it is not appropriate for the users of the legislation on the subsidiary legislation basis to have to go and read the parent law, marry up the interpretation between Section 10 and Section 15, and then figure out which one it is. This is intended to be a manual which anybody could read and understand. Don't refer to parent law. Don't refer to some sister law or brother law. Read it in one spot. In case you didn't get it, it'll be explicitly clear, bordering upon some degree of duplication of language or logic. Because you know what? We don't want any dispute about it. And that is why it is as prolix as it is. That is why it is stated in this way. And that's why, because of the risk of judicial review and other factors, we've left a certain amount of latitude in the language, Honorable Senator. Honorable Senator Mahabir, Madam President, raised the issue of having access to your lawyer. Senator Mahabir proposed that that be reasonable access. Let me put on the lawyer's hat now. Who determines reasonableness? After a decision on reasonableness is made, can it be judicially reviewed? After it is judicially reviewed, who pays the damages? Have lawyers been denied access to their child clients? Yes, they have. Which is why we put it in here that you can't deny them the access. It was to take care of the mischief which exists in reality. Because there was this debate about whether you needed permission. Could you go in and take pictures? Senator Ramdeen will tell you, he's a very experienced attorney in this field, that some lawyers have been denied access to their clients to go and take images or photographs, etc., if there's an allegation of abuse. And to avoid that mischief, we put it expressly in the law. And how did that come about? How did we become aware of this? Let me explain the process of consultation to get here today. I can tell you that I sat down myself for 6 months with these 3 regs. The order and the 2 regs. Myself on every single clause. We had the ministry, my learned colleague. We had national security. We had prisons. We had children's authority. We had the Solicitor General's Department. We had the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service Child Protection Unit. We had Legal Aid Authority. And we sat down and we sweated every single one of these clauses for basic but important things, including when do you get to see your parent? Madam President, I read the article of the mother who was re-exposed to her children after, is it 10 years she was in custody for an allegation of murder? Pardon? Yes. Doubles vendors. Left her kids at 4 and 6, went back 10 years later to be reunited with her children who still call the grandmother mommy. You know what hurt me in that story? And which is something which this government is addressing? Do you know how many times a mother is permitted under the prison's rules to see her child? Take a guess. Once per year. Once per year. That is why this government has said there's a nursery building that is incomplete on the prison's compound. We're retrofitting it. There's a mess hall that is incomplete on the prison's ground. We're building that out. We are on the prison site itself, retrofitting the prison system, just as we did with the YTC arm for the child rehabilitation centers, as this subsidiary legislation involves. We are building it out so that mothers can see their children on a continuous basis. Contact between family can prosper. We can tackle the issue of recidivism. And I want to again compliment and commend all the stakeholders, especially those very hard-working people at the Ministry of the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender Affairs Division, my hard-working colleague, Minister Webster-Roy, who despite her quiet manner is one of the strongest advocates for children's rights. It is Minister Webster-Roy who comes to cabinet and fights for the expenditure. And for the record, because I heard it raised in the submissions, can we have this work without the child rehabilitation centers being supported by the Children's Authority, etc.? It is under this minister that the allocations to the Children's Authority have doubled. It is under this minister that the staff has been improved. It is under this minister that the search for homes and child rehabilitation centers is fast at work. It is under this minister that every advertisement on a newspaper that treats with a potential retrofit.
Attorney General,
thank you, 5 minutes.
Yes.
That every potential home that is available for sale is looked at by this ministry. And I would like to take this opportunity to put onto the record 2 very important input factors and persons into this legislation, into this regulation. The first is the Honorable Chief Justice Ivor Archie, and the second is Master Christian Morris Allen. And Madam President, in drafting these regulations as we do,
Attorney General, I had made a ruling before where I had asked that we not bring...
I'll move on then. Thank you. I appreciate it. The judiciary has given significant input under its chief advocates for the prioritization of the Family and Children Division package. The Executive Court Administrator has sat at every single meeting, line by line, for 3 years straight. And Madam President, I want to ask Honorable Minister, I have two minutes. I want to ask Honorable members of the Senate. The regs are before us now. The motion has been moved that the motion itself be amended, as per Senator Mahabir and Senator Ramkisoon. I want to ask honorable senators today to appreciate where we are. We are 2 weeks away from the effective, 2 to 3 weeks away from the effective end of this parliamentary session, where the invitation is being made by my learned colleague Senator Mahabir, restart the entire process again. Restart the entire process again. And I'd like to know what is there in these regulations that can't survive the procedure, which is that we take note, we go to work, we make improvements as per suggestions, but come back on another occasion. Because if that's the undertaking that is required, I give that undertaking now on behalf of the government. And I plead with the Honorable Senate to let this see the light of day, because as we are now in operation with homes and rehabilitation centers being separated, we need to operationalize ourselves by disaggregating them between this resolution and the other resolution which will be debated later. I urge the honorable members of the Senate to let common sense prevail, to let the undertaking survive, and for us to treat with this. I look forward to fulsome submissions. I thank you for the opportunity to have a sojourn here today and then to retire elsewhere, but pay attention. And if necessary, I'll be back at committee stage to lend a hand. I thank you, Madam President.
Senator Ameen.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I thank you for the opportunity to join in this debate on the Children's Community Residences Rehabilitation Centers Regulation 2018. History will judge us by the difference we make in the everyday lives of our children. There is no doubt that the rising incidence and increasing seriousness of juvenile delinquency is of increasing concern in Trinidad and Tobago. All the speakers before me mentioned the present crime situation and how criminal activity is affecting our young people. It is my firm belief, Madam President, that the provision of opportunities, mentoring, and guidance to prevent delinquency and criminal behavior in young people. However, the rehabilitation of children who find themselves in conflict with the law, as indicated by the minister in the Ministry of the Prime Minister in piloting this motion, that comes with a responsibility of the authorities to ensure the protection, the well-being, and the rights of all juveniles. Madam President, it is unfortunate, and I see it as not a very good sign, that at the very beginning of this debate, the government says it is not in a position to consider amendments from the opposition or the independent bench. These regulations, Madam President, I do understand the willingness of the minister when she piloted to indicate that the government is willing to consider amendments put forward. But I do hear the Attorney General in his explanation as why the government feels it is unnecessary to start over the procedure. And I say this considering how these regulations were passed in the lower house, in the other place, without a debate at all, like an ambush. The opposition in the lower house had no opportunity to make an input. And here we are now. And I feel, Madam President, perhaps it is an opportunity for us to consider how we treat with regulations, because we did deal with some regulations in the DNA Act recently. And in order, where there's a bill, we have a committee stage, but perhaps it is the opportunity for us to examine our standing orders on how we can treat with regulations in terms of making amendments, because we don't have that committee stage for regulations as we do for a bill. So I feel that this exercise is one where we talk, and I look forward to, whether I am a member of this House or a private citizen, to seeing the commitment of that this government has made here today to take the suggestions for amendments into consideration. Because in my view, the regulations put forward here today are very weak and could do with strengthening. Madam President, in Trinidad and Tobago, I think the consciousness of the rights of children has been greatly influenced by international conversation, international conventions to which we are signatory. My colleague, Senator Ramdeen, spoke about the progress of Trinidad and Tobago becoming a signatory to the Geneva Convention, how long it took for legislation to be introduced in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, the role of the former government in piloting the Children Community Foster Homes and Nursery Act, but also the implementation of the Children's Authority and other institutions and other agencies to boost the welfare of children in Trinidad and Tobago. And to an extent, I agree with Minister Webster-Roy when she indicated that, when it comes to children, we should not politicize things. But the fact is that the People's Partnership had a great role to play in ensuring the well-being of the children of our nation. And we must acknowledge that, and we must give commitments, if we truly care about our children, for there to be continuity. And there were things initiated by the previous PNM government that were continued to, and made a reality, and universal preschool education is one that was realized under the People's Partnership government. So where there is good, we must have continuity. Madam President, I want to take a look at the regulations, how some of the provisions fall in line with the United Nations rules for the protection of juveniles, and some areas where they are a little deficient, and make some suggestions. But first, I want to share a little quote from Pope Francis, who was speaking at the Curran Fromhold Correctional Facility in Philadelphia. And he said, any society, any family, which cannot share or take seriously the pain of its children, the views that pain as something normal or to be accepted, is a society condemned to remain a hostage to itself. And at present, with the present criminal situation, the rate of murder, and the involvement of young people as victims and perpetrators, we in Trinidad and Tobago are in fact, to an extent, holding ourselves hostage. And that is a situation I would like to see change. And it is my strong belief that the rehabilitation of our young people has a role to play in ensuring that our adult criminal population is reduced. The United Nations rules, where it pertains to juveniles, and the protection of juveniles who are deprived of their liberty, strongly advocate for the least possible use of deprivation of liberty, especially in prisons and in closed institutions, and as far as possible to focus on rehabilitation as opposed to punishment. So there are some specific principles that are set out in these rules, and some are reflected in our regulations. So the need for separation of adults and juvenile in detention, I think we have, when it comes to male offenders, It is well known that you have the male adult prison and you have the YTC and you have the other facilities that some of which are treated with under these rules. But up to very recently, Madam President, the young women who are offenders are housed at the women's prison in Aruka. And that is a matter that I don't believe any permanent situation has been brought, any permanent solution has been brought. And that is a matter I think remains outstanding. So whereas the rules talk about separation according to...
Madam,
yes.
You said that the young women, your young girls were in conflict with the law at Aruka?
At the women's prison?
No, that's not correct. Remember, we would have had the temporary rehabilitation facility set up at St. Jude's.
Yes.
So that the one young lady who was in conflict with the law at that rehabilitation facility would have aged out. So we don't have our young girls in conflict with the law going to the women's prison.
Thank you. Minister is actually endorsing, and perhaps I should explain better. At present, well, there was an incident where there was a young female offender who was initially housed at the women's prison, and there was an intervention, which was temporary, and she was moved to the St. Jude's home. But there is no specific place for young, well, children who are female, who are offenders. So that is something, while an interim arrangement would have been made, but at present, because you don't have any females who are under the age, so in terms of license.
The young lady wasn't at St. Jude's. There was a temporary rehabilitation facility established on the compound. So she wasn't in the same space with other young girls who were in need of just care and protection at the community residence side. Right. So we actually have a facility there for the young girls.
It's temporary? Is it still existing?
It's still there. The facility is still there, just that we don't have anybody in the facility now.
Okay. So thank you, Minister. But as I said, that is a situation that recently came up, and that is one of the principles in regards to separation of adults and juveniles in detention. The classification of juveniles according to their sex, age, personality, and offense type. Facilities are separated based on gender, but when it comes to age, personality, and offense type, that is something that I don't think the facilities at present have the capacity to do. And the Attorney General mentioned in his contribution the need to keep offenders with, or children who offend in different, well, seriousness in their offense. They need to keep them separate to avoid the influence. Should a child who is in for a minor offense be housed with someone who is a habitual lawbreaker or someone who has been displayed deviant behavior or involved or alleged to commit serious crime? That is a type of separation that is required, well, is outlined in the United Nations rules, but is not, I feel that we have to bring our institutions up to capacity to treat with. The separation by personality is one that would require a lot of well, again, the human resource, because you would need to analyze these young people in terms of their personality. There are people who become criminals who display certain behaviors that can be detected during their childhood. And that, of course, would require clinical and psychiatric evaluation. Another rule that I want to mention is with regards to special provisions covering various aspects of institutional life. And a number of the rules fall into different categories. So with regards to physical environment and accommodation, Part 3 of the regulations deal largely with physical environment and accommodation. And Senator Mahabir went through a lot of them, and he spoke about some corrections he would like to see. With regards to general amenities, the kitchen facilities and so on. Sorry. That I think is pretty basic, but with regards to Regulation 9, sorry.
Honourable Senators, at this stage we will suspend the proceedings and we will return at 2 p.m. So we are suspended until 2.
This has been a presentation of the Parliament Channel and Parliament Radio 105.5 FM.